Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be doing an exercise to strengthen your understanding of altering data in JSON servers. So this is what our application is going to look like. We're going to put in, let's say, a new contact, call it Abel, and we're going to give it a random number. And we can add this contact, and if we check our server, this new contact gets added as well. We also changed the ID system. Next, we've also added the delete button. So if we head over to, let's say, Abel, and we press on the delete button, it disappears from our numbers. And if we also check our server, if we refresh the page, we can see that it also disappears from our JSON server. So we're going to navigate to our phonebook application. The first thing we're going to implement is saving our numbers to our backend, which in our case is the JSON server. We're also going to be changing the ID system that we have implemented. So we're going to head over to our save person function. And instead of simply calling the set persons function, we're going to have an Axios function. So we're going to have Axios.post, since we're going to be sending data to the server. Then we're going to have our URL. Then we're going to have the data that we want to send. In our case, is going to be the new person object. Then we're going to use the then function, which is going to give us a response. And in here, we want to alter what we see on the browser side. So we're going to use the set persons function. And we're going to pass in persons.concat. And in here, we can pass in new person, or we can pass in response.data, which is the same thing. So now our backend server is linked with our front end. And when we add a new contact, it's also going to appear in our JSON server. The next thing we said we're going to do is change the ID system. So instead of having persons.length plus 1, we're going to use the random function. And we're going to multiply it by, let's say, 1,000. So it's going to generate a random number from 0 to 1,000. And we're also going to include decimal numbers. This is going to decrease the likelihood of two contacts having the same ID. It's going to almost be impossible. Now we needed to change this for the next functionality that we're going to implement, which is deleting a contact from our server. But before that, we're going to refactor our code. That means extract the communication to the server to a separate file. So in our source folder, we're going to create a new folder called services. And in here, we're going to create a new file called persons.js. And in here, we're going to have the different communication functions. So first, we're going to import Axios. Then we're going to define our base URL variable, which is going to be HTTP localhost/persons. The first function we're going to have is create, which is going to take in a new object, and it's simply going to return Axios.post. The first input is going to be the base URL, and the second input is going to be the new object. Next, we're going to define the getAll function, which takes in no input, and it's simply going to return Axios.get, and we're going to pass in the base URL. And finally, at the bottom of our file, we're going to export the functions. So we're going to have export default, and in curly braces, we're going to have create and getAll. Now we can save this file and head over to the app file. And at the top of our app file, we're going to remove the Axios import, and instead we're going to import person services from the services folder and the persons file. Now in our useEffect function, we're going to get rid of the Axios call, and we're going to pass in person services dot then. Then we're going to head over to the save person function, and we're going to remove Axios.post. And in here, we're going to pass in person services dot create, and we're going to pass in the new person object. Now we can save our file and open the terminal, and we're going to navigate to our project. And first we're going to run our application using npm run dev. Then we're going to create a new terminal and navigate to our project again. And in here we're going to run our server using npm run server. Now we can head to our browser. Actually, before we do that, we need to fix a typo. In the use effect function, we actually need to pass in person services dot get all. Now we can save our file and head over to the browser. Let's add a new contact. Let's give it a name, Jack. And we're going to give it a random number. And we're going to press on add. On the front end, we can see that Jack has been added to our numbers list. And now if we head over to our backend and refresh the page, we can see that we have a new object, which is the new contact we just added. In addition, we can see that the ID is a randomly generated number. The next functionality we're going to add is making it possible to delete contacts. So we're going to add a delete button to each contact. And to make our code more readable, we're going to create a new component. And we're going to call it person. And it's going to take in 3 inputs. It's going to take in a name, a number, and a delete contact function. And in here, we want to return a p tag, which is going to have name, then number. And next to that, we want a button with the text delete. And this button is going to have an onClick function. And we're going to pass in delete contact. Next, we're going to head over to our persons.js file, which contains the different functions we use to communicate with the server. And in here, we're going to add a new function called del contact, which is going to take in an ID. And it's going to return a new Axios function that we haven't seen before, which is axios.delete. And in here, we're going to pass in a template string. So we're going to have our base URL. Then we're going to have a slash. Then we're going to have our ID. So this is going to generate a custom link for the contact with the given ID. Then it's going to pass it into axios.delete. And finally, we need to export this function. So we're going to add it to our export statement. And we can save this file. Now we're going to head back to our app.jsx file. First, in our return statement, instead of passing in a p tag, we're going to pass in our newly created component. So we're going to pass in the person component. And for name, we're going to give it person.name. And for number, we're going to give it person.number. We also need to provide a key since we're dealing with a list. And we're going to pass it in person.id. And finally, we need to pass in the delete contact attribute. And we're going to pass in a function we haven't defined yet. We're going to call it contact to delete. But this function is going to take in an input. And as we said in the previous video, if our function takes in an input, we need to call it in a different way. So in here, we're going to have another function. And inside this function, we're going to call the new function we're going to create, which is contact to delete. And it's going to take in an input, which is going to be an ID. So we're going to pass in person.id. And finally, we're going to close our component. Now we need to define this function. So we're going to have const contact to delete. And it's going to take in an input, which is going to be an ID. And in here, we need to first use the find function. So we're going to have const person, and we're going to set it to persons.find, which is going to give us an input p. And we want to check the condition p.id is the same as the ID we're going to pass into the function. So if that is the case, we're going to save that person to the person variable. Next, we're going to use the person services, and we're going to access the del contact function. In here, we're going to pass in the ID. So we're going to pass in person.id, and we're going to use the then function, which is going to give us a response. And in here, we want to change what we see in the browser side. So we're going to use the setPersons function, and we're going to pass in a filter. So we're going to have persons.filter, which is going to give us a person input. And if whatever we pass in to the function is true, then it's going to be included in the filter. So what we want to pass in is if person.id is not the same as the ID we passed into our function, that means that person is not selected to be deleted. And in that case, we want to display that person. So we're going to be using this filter. Now we can save our file. Before we go to the browser, we need to fix one typo. In our component, we passed in person.is. Instead, we need to pass in person.id. Now we can save our file and head over to the browser. As you can see, we have a delete button now. So we're going to head over to Jack and press on the delete button. As you can see, it disappears from the front end. And if we go over to our server, and if we refresh the page, we can see that Jack has disappeared. So this has been an exercise on altering data in our JSON server. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to show your support.